My father ripped up my acceptance letter and called me a whore. 12 years later, I let the state bury him alone. I was 18 years old the night I found out my full-ride engineering scholarship to Ashgrove State University had been shredded and stuffed at the bottom of the kitchen trash can, underneath coffee grounds and a broken eggshell, like it was garbage that needed to be hidden rather than a piece of paper that represented the only way out of the house I grew up in. I want to start there, because everything that came after, the hospital call 12 years later, the lawyer, the state guardianship paperwork, the scholarship fund I eventually built in my mother's name, all of it traces back to that trash can and to a man named Walter Hensley who believed with total conviction that educating a woman was the same thing as ruining her. My name is Dana, and I'm going to tell this whole story from the beginning because I think the ending only makes sense if you understand exactly what it took to get there. I scored a perfect 1600 on my SAT the fall of my senior year, which felt less like an achievement and more like a miracle, considering I studied for it in a locked bathroom with a flashlight because my father didn't believe girls needed test prep nonsense, and had confiscated my desk lamp specifically to stop me from staying up late with practice books. The scholarship letter came from Ashgrove State's College of Engineering, full tuition, room, board, a stipend for books, the whole thing, because apparently a perfect score and a spotless transcript from a rural public high school makes admissions committees very generous. I hid the acceptance packet in my sock drawer for exactly 9 days before my father found it while searching my room for a phone he suspected I was hiding, which, to be fair, I was. An old flip phone a friend had given me so I could call my Aunt Rosalind in an emergency. He found the phone. He found the letter. And he lost his mind in a way I had genuinely never seen before, even accounting for the fact that I had seen him lose his mind plenty of times. He screamed that I was a lying little tramp, just like my mother, that education was what turned decent women into whores who abandoned their families, that I would go to that school over his dead body. And then, almost as an afterthought, almost casually, he ripped the letter into 4 pieces, walked it to the kitchen, and dropped it in the trash on top of that morning's breakfast dishes. I stood there and watched him do it, and I did not cry, because crying in front of my father was its own kind of mistake, one that gave him more to work with. My mother, Renata, had left when I was 12, right after she finished her nursing certification at the community college, a 2-year program she'd completed almost entirely in secret, studying at the kitchen table after my father passed out from drinking, hiding her textbooks in a hollowed-out space behind the water heater in the basement. She left in the middle of the night with 1 suitcase, and for years my father told anyone who would listen that the degree ruined her, that book learning had filled her head with ideas about leaving, that education was a poison that turned loyal wives into runaways. He never once mentioned the 3 separate times I heard him slam her against the refrigerator, or the winter she wore sunglasses indoors for 2 straight weeks, or the fact that she called me exactly 4 times in the 6 years after she left before she died in a car accident on an icy overpass when I was 17, calls I only found out about years later because he'd deleted them from the answering machine before I ever heard them ring. After he tore up my acceptance letter, my father did something even worse than the tearing. He called the admissions office at Ashgrove State himself, pretending to be handling urgent family matters on my behalf, and formally declined my seat, telling them there had been a death in the family and I would not be attending. He did this without telling me. I only found out 3 weeks later when I finally worked up the nerve to call the financial aid office myself from a neighbor's landline, and the woman on the other end, after a long confused pause, told me my enrollment had already been withdrawn, by phone, by my legal guardian, and that the scholarship had been reassigned to someone on the wait list. I remember sitting on that neighbor's porch step and feeling something in my chest go completely still and cold, a kind of clarity that felt less like despair and more like ice forming over water, hardening into something you could actually stand on. That night, after my father drank himself into his usual stupor in front of the television, I walked 2 houses down and used the neighbor's phone to call my mother's older sister, Aunt Rosalind, who lived 8 hours away and who I had spoken to maybe 6 times in my entire life because my father hated her specifically, called her a bad influence and the reason your mother got ideas. I told Rosalind everything in about 90 seconds, my voice shaking, and she didn't ask a single clarifying question. She said, "Pack a bag, just the essentials. I'm leaving right now." She drove through the entire night, 8 hours straight, and pulled into our driveway right as the sky was turning that pale gray color before sunrise. My father, somehow already awake and sensing exactly what was happening, came out onto the porch in his undershirt and started shouting that I wasn't going anywhere, that I was his daughter and his responsibility until I was 25 and married off to someone decent, that Rosalind had no right to interfere in his household. What he did not expect was for Rosalind to calmly take out her phone, hold it up, and press play on a voice memo she'd apparently been quietly recording for years. Snippets of phone calls where he'd bragged about hiding cash from the IRS, admissions of things he'd done to my mother that made my stomach turn even though I already half knew them, and one particularly damning recording of him threatening a debt collector with a shotgun he wasn't legally supposed to own. She told him very evenly that she had copies saved in 3 different places, that she would drive straight to the county sheriff's office if he took one more step toward the car, and that he could decide, right now, whether he wanted to be a free man with an empty house or an inmate with a lawsuit. He stopped moving. He stood on that porch in his undershirt, jaw working, and said nothing at all as I put my one duffel bag in the trunk and got into the passenger seat of my aunt's ancient Buick. As we pulled out of the driveway, I looked back exactly once, and he was still standing there, and I have thought about that image more times in my life than almost any other. It was during the drive, somewhere around hour 3, eating gas station sandwiches at a rest stop off the interstate, that Rosalind told me something that changed how I understood my entire childhood. She said that in the 2 years before the accident that killed her, my mother had been secretly sending Rosalind money every single month. Small amounts, $40 here, $60 there, money she'd scraped together from odd cleaning jobs she wasn't supposed to be doing, with a single instruction attached. If anything ever happened to her, and if Dana ever needed a way out, use this money to help her go to school. My mother had died believing she would never get the chance to rescue me herself, and so she had built a tiny, secret escape hatch instead, funded a few dollars at a time, hidden in her sister's bank account for 6 years, waiting. I cried in that rest stop parking lot in a way I hadn't let myself cry in front of my father in years. With Rosalind's help and that quiet fund my mother had built, I petitioned Ashgrove State for reinstatement, wrote an essay explaining the circumstances that a very kind admissions counselor named Delphine Ruiz fought internally to get approved, and I started as a freshman 1 semester late, living in a dorm for the first time in my life with a door that actually locked from the inside, a fact that made me cry from relief more than once during that first month. I studied civil engineering. I graduated first in my class with a bachelor's degree, then went straight into a master's program, working 2 jobs the entire time because Rosalind's fund only stretched so far, and I refused, on principle, to ever ask my father for a single cent. By the time I was 26, I had my master's degree, a junior engineering position at a respected infrastructure firm called Corvallis and Kettering, and an apartment of my own that nobody could enter without my permission. I built a life that looked, from the outside, completely normal, and from the inside felt like something closer to a miracle I still didn't fully trust. For 12 years, I had almost no contact with my father. I sent Rosalind a card every Christmas. I did not send him one. Then, on an ordinary Tuesday in October, while I was standing over a set of structural drawings for a pedestrian bridge retrofit project, going over the load calculations with my colleague Priya for the 3rd time that morning, my phone rang with a number I didn't recognize, a hospital area code from my old hometown. A nurse named Colette from Ridgemont Mercy Hospital told me my father had suffered a massive ischemic stroke 3 days earlier, that he had been unconscious and then unresponsive when they tried to reach next of kin, and that my name and old cell number, apparently never updated, were the only emergency contact information on file. She said the situation was serious, that he had significant left-side paralysis and expressive aphasia, that he would likely need long-term skilled nursing care, and then, in a tone that I recognized immediately as the tone people use when they're about to ask you for something enormous while pretending it's a small thing, she asked when I would be able to come make arrangements. I told her I needed to think, and hung up, and sat very still at my desk for almost 20 minutes while Priya quietly brought me a cup of coffee and didn't ask a single question, because Priya was one of maybe 3 people at that firm who knew even a fraction of my history. Over the next week, the hospital called 4 more times. A neurologist named Dr. Okafor explained the medical situation to me in detail I hadn't asked for, clearly assuming that once I understood the severity, I would naturally step up, the way children are supposed to. A hospital social worker mentioned, almost as a throwaway line, that family caregivers usually find it very meaningful in the end. Nobody at that hospital knew a single thing about who my father actually was, and I found myself in the strange position of having to explain over and over to strangers in scrubs that this was not a man who deserved meaningful. I finally said plainly to the fourth caller that I was not going to be taking him into my home, that I was not going to be managing his care, and that I needed to speak with someone about what my actual legal obligations were because I genuinely did not know. That conversation led me, on Priya's recommendation, to an elder law attorney named Margaret Ellsworth, a sharp, silver-haired woman who listened to my entire history without a single flicker of judgment and then told me something that felt like being handed a lifeline underwater. She said that in this state, as in the vast majority of states, adult children have no default legal obligation to provide physical care or financial support for a parent, abusive or otherwise, and that the handful of filial responsibility statutes that exist elsewhere are rarely enforced and generally carve out exceptions for documented abuse or abandonment. She helped me draft and file a formal declination of medical and financial guardianship, a document stating clearly, on the record, that I would not be serving as his healthcare proxy, his financial power of attorney, or his caregiver in any capacity. She told me this was not just legally sound, but, in her professional opinion, the correct decision. And something about hearing a stranger in a blazer say that so calmly undid a knot in my chest I didn't know I'd been carrying for over a decade. With the guardianship declined, the case was reassigned to a state adult protective services caseworker named Owen Marsh, a tired-sounding but kind man who explained that the county would now petition for state guardianship, apply for Medicaid on my father's behalf given his lack of assets, and place him in a public long-term care facility once he was medically stable enough to transfer. He asked me gently whether I wanted to be kept informed about his condition going forward. I told him I wanted exactly one piece of information for the rest of this process: notification if and when he died. Nothing else. No updates on his condition, no calls about decisions, no invitations to weigh in. He wrote it down and told me he understood completely, and something in his voice told me he had seen this exact situation before and did not think less of me for it. Word travels fast in a small town, even when the person at the center of the story has been gone for 12 years, and within 2 weeks my cousin Denise left me a voicemail calling me a cold-hearted excuse for a daughter for abandoning your own father while he's paralyzed in a hospital bed, and my cousin Curtis sent an email, an actual formal email, accusing me of turning your back on family when it mattered most. I didn't respond to either of them for several days, mostly because I needed time to remember that I did not, in fact, owe them an explanation. But eventually I called Curtis back, because something about his email had specifically mentioned family loyalty, and I wanted to say one thing to his face, or at least to his voice. I reminded him of Thanksgiving 6 years earlier, the one and only time I'd attempted to reconnect, when my father had spent an entire dinner insinuating loudly, in front of the whole extended family, that the reason I'd run off to the city was because I was selling myself to older men, and Curtis had sat there, fork in hand, and said absolutely nothing, hadn't so much as glanced up from his plate, while I sat there humiliated in front of 12 relatives. I asked him where his sense of family loyalty had been that night. He didn't have an answer. He just went quiet, mumbled something about not wanting to get in the middle of things, and the call ended shortly after that. And he never contacted me again. About a month later, I got a very different kind of call. This one from my cousin Patricia, Curtis's older sister, who I'd always liked but hadn't spoken to in years. She called just to apologize, unprompted, and told me something I hadn't fully understood before, that basically everyone in the extended family had always known exactly what my father was, had seen the bruises my mother tried to hide with makeup at Christmas gatherings, had heard him scream at me over the phone during family calls loud enough that people had to hold the receiver away from their ears, and had simply chosen, for years, to say nothing, because confronting him meant confronting an ugly reality none of them wanted to deal with. She said the relatives calling me heartless weren't doing it because they actually loved him or missed him. Most of them, she said bluntly, couldn't stand being in a room with him either. They were reacting out of some inherited, unexamined idea that blood obligates you to sacrifice yourself regardless of what that blood has done to you, a script they'd absorbed from their own parents and never questioned. That phone call did something for me that no amount of therapy had quite managed to do up to that point. It confirmed, from someone who had actually witnessed my childhood, that I was not the villain in this story, no matter how loudly people who had never lifted a finger to protect me wanted to insist that I was. Around this same time, my boyfriend Nathan, a quiet, steady structural inspector I'd been with for almost 3 years, said something to me one night on our apartment balcony that I still think about constantly. I'd been spiraling a little, wondering out loud whether I was a bad person, whether some fundamental piece of decency was missing in me because I felt so little pity for a dying man. And Nathan took my hand and said very simply that refusing to sacrifice yourself for someone who spent your entire childhood trying to destroy you isn't coldness, it's survival, and that surviving him once as a teenager didn't obligate me to survive him a second time as an adult. I started seeing a therapist not long after that, a calm, unhurried woman named Dr. Ferris, who told me something in one of our early sessions that I wrote down on a sticky note and kept on my bathroom mirror for the better part of a year. That I was allowed to grieve the father I should have had, the one who should have shown up to my science fairs and taught me to drive and hugged me when my mother died, without owing a single ounce of obligation to the actual father who had done none of those things and had instead spent 18 years trying to make sure I never left his house. That distinction, grieving the fantasy while owing nothing to the reality, became something close to a permanent anchor for me over the following months. Then, one afternoon in late November, Owen Marsh called with an update I hadn't asked for, but that he clearly felt obligated to pass along. He told me that when my father had been informed, through the halting, painstaking communication methods his speech therapist had worked out given his aphasia, that his daughter had formally declined to take him in or manage his care, he had become extremely agitated and had spent nearly 10 minutes trying to force out words through his partially paralyzed mouth, garbled, slurred sounds that his speech-language pathologist, after careful review, was fairly confident translated to a string of insults, the clearest of which resembled the exact same phrase he'd screamed at me the night he found my acceptance letter 12 years earlier. Owen told me this almost apologetically, like he wasn't sure whether it would hurt me or not, and I remember sitting with the information for a moment and realizing that it did the opposite of hurt me. It settled something. Whatever small, stubborn part of me had been quietly hoping that a near-death stroke might have softened him, might have revealed some buried tenderness underneath decades of cruelty, that part of me finally, fully let go. He was exactly who he had always been, right down to the last intact scraps of language his damaged brain could produce. And there was something almost clarifying, almost merciful to my own conscience, in knowing that for certain. Not long after that call, my Aunt Rosalind, now in her early 60s and still the fiercest person I have ever known, drove up to visit me for a weekend and brought with her a small, water-stained cardboard box she'd kept in her attic for over a decade. My mother's old journals, things Rosalind had quietly taken from the house the same week she'd rescued me, worried my father would burn them otherwise. We sat on my living room floor and read through them together for hours, and somewhere in the middle of the third notebook, dated the year before she died, I found pages of my mother's careful, cramped handwriting documenting dates, times, descriptions of injuries, threats she'd overheard, all of it clearly assembled with a specific purpose. She had been quietly building a case, gathering evidence to petition for full custody of me, planning to file the moment she had enough saved to hire a lawyer and rent an apartment of her own. She never got the chance. The accident took that possibility from both of us before she could act on it. But reading those pages, I understood for the first time that her leaving hadn't been abandonment, hadn't been the selfish act my father had spent years insisting it was. It had been the opening move in a rescue plan she was still executing in secret up until the day she died, a plan that had continued invisibly through that hollowed-out fund she left with Rosalind, a plan that had, in its own delayed and roundabout way, actually worked. I cried harder reading those journals than I had at any point since the night I left home. A few months later, I was invited to speak on a panel about women in engineering at Ashgrove State, the same university that had almost lost me 12 years earlier, sitting alongside 2 other alumni in front of a room of undergraduates. During the question period, a nervous sophomore near the back raised her hand and asked, in a voice that clearly cost her something to use, what you're supposed to do when your own family doesn't want you to succeed, when they actively try to stop you from getting an education. I told her, as honestly and specifically as I could without turning the whole panel into my own therapy session, that I had once had an acceptance letter torn up and thrown in the trash by someone who was supposed to protect me, and that I had gotten to this stage anyway, and that sometimes choosing yourself over a family member's approval isn't betrayal. It's the only door out of a room that was never going to open on its own. Afterward, 3 different young women came up to talk to me privately, and one of them, shaking slightly, told me her own father had recently taken her passport to physically prevent her from studying abroad. I gave her Margaret Ellsworth's number and a hug, and I thought, walking out to my car that night, that this was maybe the first time my history with my father had ever produced something other than pain. Around the same time, I was formally promoted to lead engineer on a major 2-year bridge rehabilitation project for Corvallis and Kettering, my first time managing an engineering team of my own, a role that came with a substantial raise and a signing bonus I genuinely hadn't been expecting. I used most of that bonus, along with a portion of my new salary, to establish something I'd been quietly designing in the back of my mind for over a year: the Renata Hensley Memorial Scholarship, named for my mother, awarding 2 full scholarships every year specifically to young women trying to pursue higher education against the active opposition of a controlling or abusive family member. No essay contest sentimentality required, just a straightforward application, and if needed, a confidential conversation with a small review committee that included Margaret Ellsworth as a volunteer advisor. Watching the first 2 recipients get announced felt like closing a loop that had been open since I was 18 years old, standing in front of a trash can. In February, almost 16 months after the first stroke, Owen Marsh called to tell me my father had suffered a second, larger stroke, and that his condition had deteriorated to the point where he had been transferred to hospice care, comfort measures only, and that the medical team estimated he likely had days rather than weeks left. He asked very delicately whether I wanted to visit before the end. I told him no, but I asked him to make sure the hospice staff kept him as physically comfortable as possible. Adequate pain management, nothing more, nothing less. Because whatever else was true, I did not want him to suffer physically in his final days out of some misplaced idea that he deserved it. There is a difference, I've learned, between refusing to sacrifice yourself for someone and actively wishing them pain, and I wanted to stay on the correct side of that line, even at the very end. He died 8 days later, in the final week of December, in his sleep, according to the hospice nurse who called Margaret's office rather than me directly, per my instructions. Because he had been made a ward of the state with no remaining assets, and no family willing to claim the body, the county handled his burial arrangements through its standard indigent services, a plain plot in a public cemetery section, no service, no headstone beyond a small flat marker. I did not attend anything. I did not send flowers. I closed out the case file with Margaret's office 2 weeks later, signing the last of the paperwork at her office with Nathan sitting beside me. And I felt, when I set that pen down, less like I had lost a father, and more like I had finally, formally, set down a weight I'd been carrying my entire adult life without realizing how heavy it actually was. That spring, on a warm Saturday in April, Aunt Rosalind and I drove out to the small cemetery where my mother is buried. A modest but well-kept plot Rosalind had maintained faithfully for over a decade. I brought 3 things with me and laid them carefully in the grass in front of her headstone: a printed copy of my master's degree, the official letter announcing my promotion to lead engineer, and the founding documents for the Renata Hensley Memorial Scholarship, complete with a photo of the first 2 recipients smiling outside their dormitories. I sat there for a long time in the spring sun, Rosalind's hand resting quietly on my shoulder, and I realized with a clarity that felt earned rather than given, that I didn't need any apology or acknowledgement from the man who had spent my childhood trying to break me, because I had never actually needed his approval to become whole. I had needed my mother's, and in the only way she had left to give it, hidden in a shoebox of cash sent to her sister a few dollars at a time, she had given it to me years before she died, and I had spent 12 years, without fully realizing it, living exactly the life she had been quietly betting on the whole time.